Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is actually going to be helping me out today, so we can give you a little bit more variety. Everyone say hi.
Number 9. The Penitential of Bushau de Worms. The Penitential of Bushau de Worms is a manuscript from the 11th century, written by a medieval doctor or corrector named Bushau. Bushau was a famous bishop of the German Imperial Church. He was not your typical churchman. He was a humanist who preached moderate justice and aimed to build morals, even if those morals were ludicrous. The penitential was a guide used during the sacrament of penance, aka someone confessing their sins to a priest or bishop. It includes a series of sins described briefly and then followed by an atonable cost or duty according to the gravity of the sin. Basically, it followed the ideas of retributive justice, where based on how bad the sin was, the punishment should be equally as bad. Not more extreme, which often was the case in the Middle Ages. The Penitential of Bushau de Worms is rather substantial. It's composed of 159 chapters that cover various sins and other transgressions based on Christian values. Those who wanted to repent for their sins must answer a questionnaire consisting of 194 questions just in order to confess and then absolve their sins. Sins included things like adultery, homicide, as well as diabolical or pagan beliefs and practices, and also provides a lot of insight into sexuality during medieval times. There were also other very odd sins that he covered in detail, not things that you might expect, and usually sexual in nature. This questionnaire was even weirder for women. I can't explain too much here, but there was a question that asked if you killed a live fish with a certain body part, then cooked it and fed it to their husbands so they would fall in love with them. If you answered yes, then you would do penance for 2 years on the established days. He might have given people some weird ideas. This manual was an incredibly long guide designed for bishops to use in visitations and in their daily administrative lives on how to rid someone of guilt when they did something the church didn't approve of. Number 8. Animals were taken to court. Records show that at least 85 animals were put on trial during the Middle Ages for alleged criminal wrongdoings. That's right. Just like a person has to go to court when they're accused of breaking the law today, the medieval world held pigs, roosters, rats, a donkey, and even dolphins liable for the claims that were made against them. Pigs were taken to trial more than any other animal for acts like supposedly biting off people's body parts and devouring children. A guilty conviction usually meant being hanged or burned at the stake. In 1386, a pig was dressed in a suit, gloves, and a mask, resembling a human face prior to being executed. Nearly a century later, a rooster was accused and found guilty of the so-called unnatural crime of laying an egg. Some animals, but not many, were spared from the horrific consequences of their alleged crimes. For example, a donkey was let off the hook for a sexual offense after one of her caretakers wrote to the court clarifying that she was wholesome and well-behaved. Number 7. Witnessing the act. Before the 12th century, couples could legally marry just by verbally consenting to one another and declaring themselves husband and wife. They didn't need anyone's permission, and a formal ceremony happened much later on. This way of doing things made it easy for people to wed, leading to marriages in all sorts of places, including on the street and in the bedroom. But it made it difficult for everyone else, including the authorities and people's families, to determine who was actually married and who wasn't. So during the 12th century, the rules around marriage were changed. Officials decided that it was a holy sacrament and that it had to be witnessed by God. You may be surprised to learn that this often included not just the wedding ceremony, but the act of consummating the marriage. In a ritual known as bedding, which was especially popular among the upper classes, a bride's family often carried her to her marital bed right after the wedding ceremony. Then they stood around and waited for the act to be finished, with the couple only having a bed curtain for privacy at best. If they were really lucky, the bystanders would leave right before the consummation took place. In Iceland, at least 6 men had to witness the bedding ceremony in order for the marriage to be valid. The act wasn't observed for fun, but because in many cases the marriage wasn't considered legally binding until it was made official in this sense. Without consummation, A marriage could be easily annulled and everyone's ambition ruined, and the tradition varied from place to place. In 16th century Germany, for example, bedding was performed to the sounds of pipes, drums, and obscene noises. Sadly, one thing was pretty much universal when it came to medieval marriages. Women had virtually no say in who they married or when. Girls were typically deemed marriageable at around 12 years old, while boys were considered ready at 14. Number 6. Dancing Plague. One day in 1518, residents in Strasbourg, France, began dancing wildly out of nowhere. The seemingly uncontrolled movements continued in the streets for days on end, as more and more people joined the chaotic growing crowd. Historical records claim that the so-called dancing plague began with a woman called Mrs. Trophia. Her bizarre behavior seemed to have a contagious effect, particularly on young women. At its peak, the crowd grew to include at least 400 people, and none of them were having fun. The ailing dancers were extremely uncomfortable and exhausted from their strange, constant movements. Many people ended up in the hospital, where as many as 15 sufferers died daily when the plague was at its worst. Doctors determined that the dancers were not possessed, even though they were certainly acting like they were, and that they were suffering from overheated blood. Since putting people in the hospital didn't seem to alleviate the symptoms, local officials built a large stage for patients to use to get the dancing out of their system. It took around 3 months for the strange illness to go away entirely. To this day, experts are unsure of what caused the dancing plague of 1518 and several others like it. They suspect that food poisoning or some other physical condition could have been responsible. There's also a theory that the dancers were suffering from a widespread psychiatric illness known as mass hysteria. This phenomenon occurs when a large number of people automatically believe a rumor or idea without thinking very deeply about it. Fear and paranoia makes populations especially vulnerable to mass hysteria, and given the wildly superstitious tendencies that people were known to have during the Middle Ages, this explanation makes a lot of sense. When the dancing plague of 1518 happened, the people of the Alsace region were already suffering from disease and starvation. Their desperation may have made them especially prone to mass hysteria, which seems to be more common among suffering societies than those that are doing well. Number 5. Legally sanctioned husband and wife fistfights. During the medieval era, it wasn't entirely uncommon for two parties to settle a dispute in court by physically duking it out. And while the practice became rare by the late Middle Ages, it persisted in some cases. University of Oklahoma professor Kenneth L. Hodges wrote about the guidelines for trial by combat based on a 15th century German manuscript, which specifies the types of judicial duels that took place and the types of weapons that people were allowed to use. It also contained drawings demonstrating the proper procedure and technique for the different kinds of fights, including husband and wife battles. While judicial duels were more common among men who were accused of crimes, it wasn't unheard of for women to be subjected to this truly medieval way of being brought to justice. In fact, some even chose it as their preferred way of resolving a case against them, and oftentimes they selected their husband as their opponent. When this happened, the husband would stand in a waist-deep hole, armed with a club. The wife stood near the hole's edge with a cloth that contained a heavy rock. The manuscript is unclear about how a winner was determined in cases that resulted in anything other than death or dismemberment, but Hodges theorized that the reason the husband had to stand in a hole was to even out the chances of either partner emerging victorious. If this practice were still around today, do you think more wives would try to fight their husbands to solve their marital issues? Let me know in the comments, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 4. Courtly love. It was common practice during the Middle Ages for people of nobility to marry for status and money. A lot of the time, especially for women, a young person had no choice over who they entered wedlock with. Consequently, there were a lot of married couples who weren't exactly crazy about each other, especially among society's elite ranks. To make up for the lack of closeness that many husbands and wives experienced, medieval society had a set of social practices called courtly love. Originally thought up as a fictional concept, it allowed both men and women to openly practice certain elements of love, regardless of whether or not they were married. Courtly love included dancing, holding hands, and other behaviors that, at the time, might have been considered risque. There were limits, however, and sex was limited strictly to one's legal spouse. Only nobles were allowed to practice courtly love, which became popular during the 11th and 12th centuries. Evidence suggests that not everyone followed the rules, however. Medieval poems sometimes mention married women and their male admirers sharing beds and sleeping in one another's arms. This implied privacy makes it hard to believe that they didn't go any further than that. Number 3. Audacious fashion for men. The medieval period saw some bizarre fashion trends, to put it mildly. Included among these fads were obnoxiously long pointed shoes. Men displayed their social status and wealth through their footwear, with the longest shoes being worn only by members of the most elite classes. Sometimes their footwear was so long that the ends had to be tied around the wearer's ankles. But if you think that sounds strange, wait until you learn about an infinitely weirder trend that took hold during the 14th century. Known as the codpiece, this clothing item was an oversized pouch that affixed to the front of a man's pants, and yes, it was designed with size in mind. It came during a time when it was becoming increasingly popular for men to wear revealing clothing, including extremely short tunics with skin-tight leggings. The custom padded codpiece, adjusted to the size of the wearer's choosing, was seen as a way to emphasize one's masculinity. In 1337, a new set of laws were passed in England to prevent people from dressing above their social class and to preserve decency. By then, men had gotten so provocative with their fashion that their attire raised moral concerns. But this did little to solve the problem. Tunics got shorter and body parts became even more exposed. In 1463, a new law specifically banned men beneath the rank of lord from wearing shirts that did not cover their behinds and private parts. It also addressed the long pointy shoes by limiting the length of the points to 2 inches, 5 centimeters for commoners. Only members of the higher classes could wear longer shoes. Those who violated the policy were fined. Number 2. Outlawing. Nowadays, we think of an outlaw as a fugitive fleeing from justice, or even simply as an individual who has broken the law. In medieval England, outlawry was an actual legal mechanism that stripped a person of all their rights and permitted the public to kill the outlaw if they crossed paths with them. Simply put, an outlaw was no longer protected under the law like ordinary civilians were. A person could be outlawed for things like treason, rebellion, conspiracy, and other serious felonies. There were also civil causes for imposing outlawry on someone, including outstanding debt and parliamentary petitions for whatever reasons they saw fit. During the early Middle Ages, most cases of outlawry stemmed from criminal allegations, but the practice gradually grew to also become a common civil punishment. When someone was outlawed, the crown seized their property and possessions. Outlaws could fight their outcasted status by appearing in court and convincing those in power that the court had mistakenly imposed outlawry on them as a result of errors in the judiciary proceedings. They could also ask for a pardon. Those who were lucky enough to regain their civilian status went back to their normal lives, and in some cases, they even got their property and belongings back. Number 1. Stifling sleeping arrangements. There are different standards among culture when it comes to what's considered an appropriate sleeping arrangement. It's not entirely uncommon in some parts of the world for people to share a bed with their kids. Even in the United States, many parents allow their young children to sleep with them in their bed. But during the Middle Ages, sleeping arrangements reached a level of closeness that would be downright disturbing under modern standards. Entire families, their guests, and their servants often crammed together on the same mattress. This was mainly done because households typically only had one bed, but also because they lacked heating systems, requiring family members and friends to keep each other warm with their body heat. Communal sleeping was also a way for female householders to protect their women servants from the unwelcome advances of men who lived in the home. Beds began to take on their modern form and appearance sometime during the 15th century, but remained very much a communal piece of furniture for most households. And this wasn't just a practice among commoners. In fact, wealthy people often invested in very large and fancy beds that more or less functioned as centerpieces in their homes. During the 12th century, King Richard I of England and King Philip II of France shared a bed as a demonstration of their diplomacy with one another. Much like couples today often have a preferred side of the bed, each family member had a specific place on their shared mattress. But rather than being chosen, these places were often assigned by parents based on the family member's age and gender. Communal sleeping continued for centuries past the medieval period and well into the 19th century in some places. Thanks for watching. Which one of these medieval practices shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. See you next time. Bye.